Hello and welcome AWS friends to this lesson about Amazon API Gateway. Before we get started and create our first API, let's have a look on the Amazon documentation. Amazon API Gateway is an AWS service that enables developers to create, publish, maintain, monitor and secure APIs at any scale. You can create APIs that access AWS or other web services as well as data stored in the AWS cloud. You find a lot of useful information in this documentation. Please have a look at your own. As you can see, there is a get started, there's how to create a API. For us, this will be enough to get started. Now let's create our first API. So I will just say get started, and I can switch now between create a new API, import a API from Swagger, or we can use this example API, and I'm gonna stick to this. You can find the Swagger documentation for this example API here in this text field. I'm gonna say the endpoint is regional. It's pretty fine for this tutorial, and I'm going to say import. Now you find your first API here, pet store. This is the example. Now let's have a look on detail. What are the most important parts of this API? One of the most important parts of your API you can find under resources. This is where you define your API, where you define your internal endpoints. In our case, we have under /pets two methods, a get method and a post method. And let's have a look on this get method. On any method you can always use this test button to see if this works. And in our case it seems to work. It returns 3 pets. If we want to test the post method, of course we have to paste some JSON definition in this method here. I won't do this by now. And now let's have a closer look on these endpoint methods. For any method you define, you will have an integration request, and this is the interesting part. Here you can define what service or what method, what HTTP URL you try to reach. So the first possibility is calling a Lambda function. Next one, what we are doing and what is selected in here is a HTTP method, and you can find the URL here in this text field. You can define the method, in our case that's get, but you can also define delete, get, all these other methods. You can define a mock. This is useful, for example, if you are API producer and your consumers are waiting for your API, but some of your methods are not ready yet, and you can define these methods already and use this mock integration and just return 200, for example. Or it's also useful to test error handling. You can return 400 or 500 code, and this way it's easy to implement your error handling on a REST method that will return a error code. You can also select AWS services and, for example, access straight ahead DynamoDBs or some other services. And the last option is VPC link. This is mainly a network load balancer. We can define this by here. Let's have a look on this later. And so by now, these are the most important parts. You can also define your path parameters. In our case, it's a simple get method without any path parameters. You can define your query strings and your HTTP header. In resources you have some actions. For example, you can create a new resource. Let's define our resource docs. And now we not only have /pads, but we also have /docs. And now let's define a new method under docs. So I want a simple method. I want a get method, And once I have defined this, I have to select my integration type. Let's try a simple one, HTTP, and call Google. And press test. And now you can see it will return a response from Google. Also important to know about resources. On the method request level, you can define some security issues or settings. For example, you can define authorization, which is in here none. This is Amazon Identity and Access Management, or it could be also Cognito user pool. You can also define a API key. We don't have defined the API key yet, so we can't use it. But if you define one by here, you can use an API key to secure your method. And we have this request validator. And I will use none for this little tutorial. Before you can publish your API, you have to define stages. You find stages here in the next tab. You can also create one stage on here, or you can do it while you're deploying your API. So if you want to publish your API and you did some changes, you always have to call deploy API. And if you have already stages, you will find your defined stages in this combo box. I will just say create new stage and say deploy. Once the stage is deployed, you can find it on here, though here you can find multiple stages, dev, in, prod for example. And now let's have a look on our methods. And for example, our dogs get or our pets get method. So let's try our pets get. And here you can find the dogs, the pets methods. It's already HTTPS. And it's the same response we have seen in the resource section. The URL is a little bit strange. This is nothing you want to give a client or a user. So we have a look on how to use a custom domain a little bit later. But for your first check if your API is working, you can use these stages and try these URLs of all these methods by here. A very interesting feature of these stages are these, for example, stage variables, where you can define variables for your different stages. So you can define, for example, for dev and for int different domains, internal domains. If you have, for example, microservices running in on dev environment and on the int environment, you can define these URLs for your dev microservices or for your int microservice if you have an int stage in these stage variables. And now you can use these stage variables in your resources. Let's try these with dogs. Now we have to replace this domain in here with our stage variable. And now this will be exchanged when you deploy your API to the stage dev, for example, with this variable, or for example for int or prod to another URL. Very useful function. You have some more options on your stages, but I won't explain all of these features here in this short tutorial. Please, you can secure your API with authorization. Before you can use this feature, you have to define authorizers. Let's create a new one. You can choose between Lambda and Cognito. And let's say I want to use Cognito authorization. I'm gonna explain Cognito with API gateway in a dedicated lesson. This is a very mighty feature, and I can't explain all this in this little API gateway tutorial, but for now we just define a Cognito authorizer. We won't talk about this user pool of Cognito, but all you have to know, you have to enter your user pool, which has to be defined in advance, and use a token source, and then you can say create, and you have an authorizer. And if you turn back to resources, let's switch to our docs method, and now in authorization you not only have IAM, you will also have this Cognito user pool. Looks like we have to refresh this site. And now you can use Cognito for authorization. I won't do this by now, but to let you know, this is possible by defining authorizers. What else? We have our responders, so you can define response codes for your REST methods. We have already these default settings, and I think we will get along with this. But if you need some special codes, you have to define it by here. Here you can find your JSON models, your response models. We have this resource polity, which you can define. You have a documentation. We have a little dashboard with some informations on your API calls and latency and all this stuff, how many errors occurred, 400 or 500 errors, very interesting. So from time to time, take a look on your API dashboard. And we have some general settings, for example, API key. And let's talk about this API key by now. You can either import an existing API key or just use the create key function. Say auto generate and save this key, and once you have your own API key, you can use it to secure your methods, for example with an API key, by just saying true. Nice feature. A very interesting feature is custom domain names. As you remember, we are still calling our API methods by this URL, and this is not what you want to give to your clients or to your customers. So we have to define a custom domain. First you have to, of course, own your own domain, for example, and this you can find in your Route 53 settings. And what else do you need to create a custom domain? You need a server certificate. You can use the certificate manager service on AWS to create a server certificate. In my case, I created this certificate, just say request, and I'm using the star API domain name certificate, and this is what you can choose when you, for example, say new custom domain, and you say regional, then you can switch on your existing certificates. You also need a record in your DNS configuration. You have to copy your target domain name once you have created your custom domain name, and you have to switch to Route 53. Switch to your hosted zone and create a CNAME record set with your subdomain, and paste this target domain name here in the record set and save this record set. Very important step. If you don't do this, your custom domain will not be available. And once you have defined your custom domain, you can define base path mappings. Let's try this by now. So just say add mapping, you can select your existing APIs. In our case, there's just one API. And now you have to change the, you have to select the stages. We have only defined one by now. For example, dev. If you have more, you can select between dev, int, whatever. Be aware you then, for example, have to define, of course, a selector for your stages. You can also define a star to make your base path mapping working for different stages. For our purpose, for our tutorial, let's save this by now and try our custom domain by now. Let's see if our API is available under this domain. So our domain will be HTTPS API and this domain, and then we need the path defined for our resources. Let's try, for example, this pets_get method. Let's take a look at stages so it's easier to see what is the path. So the path is dev/pets, but we won't need dev because we have already defined in our custom domain we are using this dev stage, and therefore we need HTTPS, our domain, and pets, and that's it. Now our REST methods are available with this nice little domain. We also have the chance to define client certificates. This is a pretty easy function. Just use this generate button. We won't talk about this in detail. Please have a look at the documentation. VPC links, that's interesting. To use VPC links, you need a network load balancer. As you can see, I don't have one defined by yet. This is an important point. Your API gateway is not enabled to access internal load balance, for example. So if you have microservices on an internal ECS cluster or on an EC2 instance in a private subnet, and you have your load balancer also defined in your private subnets, you won't be able to access these methods with a load balancer. If you place your load balancer in the public subnets, it's also available from the internet, and the whole API gateway doesn't make so much sense because you can also reach your methods with the load balancer. So therefore it's a good thing to define a network load balancer. Now you can define a VPC link, and you can use this VPC link as a endpoint option in your integration requests. Now you select VPC link, you select your existing network load balancer, and you define also a HTTP method. You can also use, of course, stage variables, the same stuff like HTTP, but now you're not reaching your methods straight ahead. By HTTP, you're making the way through your network load balancer. Last thing is you have some general settings. This is not this interesting. So far we have a good overview on API Gateway and its most important features and resources. Now, since we have created a API with the web console, I want to show you also a very interesting method to create an API. This is by CloudFormation, and I would recommend you create most of your resources in AWS with an infrastructure as a code tool, for example CloudFormation or Terraform. Now let's create a second API with CloudFormation. So we need a CloudFormation stack to create this API. Let's have a look. This is a stack to create an API with CloudFormation, and we're gonna have a look in detail while we deploy this. And now let's create our general API. Just say next, and we just have to give it a name. We don't have any more parameters. Yes, we do have, but I placed some defaults in my stack, so you can use this and change, of course, these certificate ARNs or your custom domain name. You will find this CloudFormation stack in my GitHub account. Feel free to modify it and use it. And now say create. So status is create in progress. Let's have a look on our CloudFormation. These are the three parameters we have seen: certificate, API name, and custom domain name. And then the most important resource is very simple. It's the API itself. Now we have a CloudWatch logs role. This is not this important for here, but this is interesting. Now we define our resources. This is our level 0 resource. Now we have a resource, it's called level 0, is called API domain. Of course, you have to change this in something you want to use. Next level is, for example, API domain /v1, and the next resource is v1/health. And we have some more resources. We have also defined a pets resource. This is placed under level 1. So under v1 you will also find pets. Now we have to define our methods. You have a health request method, we have a pets request method. So I'm here creating a API similar to this pets example. And here is a pets request post. And there is a new, and now comes the model. We have a new pet model. We have a pet type. So I'm defining the same model like in this pets example. Last we have an output, and we will get our URL for our custom domain. Let's switch back to CloudFormation and see if our stack was created. Yes, create complete. And by now we should see a second API in our API gateway. And here it is, my API created by CloudFormation. You can see by resources we have an API domain resource v1 health, one method under health. And we have a pets resource with two methods, get and post. We have two stages, all defined by CloudFormation. And I think I also put a stage variable in my CloudFormation. Yes, here it is. There's also an example using stage variables. We won't have authorizers, but we also defined our model in this CloudFormation, and also defined is the custom domain. So by now you should have a good knowledge on API gateway. Thanks for listening and see you on the next lesson.